Hello, I'm Julie Baddeley, Chair of Chapter Zero, the UK Directors Climate Forum. Welcome to our contribution to the Climate Governance Initiative Summit, which we've developed in collaboration with the Global Association of Risk Professionals. And a big thank you to Jo Paisley and her team for all the work that they've put into this. This is the third time we've run such a session where you, the participants, act as the board of a fictitious company. People say they found it challenging, but also a lot of fun, and I hope that will be the case today. Chapter Zero is the UK chapter of the CGI, with more than 2,200 members. We work to equip UK non-exec chairs and directors to lead debate in the boardroom and drive action towards net zero and resilience. We've been established for more than 3 years, and our tools, including our board scorecard, board toolkit, and key explainers on matters to do with business and climate, are available on our website free of charge. If you know of any UK-based non-executive directors who are not yet members of Chapter Zero, please encourage them to join. If they are experts, they can share their knowledge with others. If they have a lot to learn, they can benefit from the knowledge of the network. So I'll now hand over to Jo Paisley from GARP, who will take us through today's scenario.
Great, thanks very much, Julie, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. So before I get going, though, on the scenario itself, just a few technical tips to make sure that you get the most out of today's broadcast. If your screen freezes, just press F5. That usually does the trick. Any technical difficulties you can troubleshoot by clicking on the yellow help icon, or you can just type the question into the Q&A box. You can also type questions for the expert panel. We'll come to that at the end of the game, so hold back for now. You can also download today's slides by clicking on I think it's the green icon. There's an icon there on the console. And finally, you can resize any of the windows by just holding down and dragging the bottom right-hand corner. So you can optimize for however you want the display to look. Okay, so with that boring bit out of the way, the session today has 3 parts. I'm going to Okay, so that was a bit of fun. I got kicked off. I don't know if anybody took over, but I'm back. Can you hear me now?
We can now, Jo. No, we didn't take over because we weren't sure if it was our own systems that had failed or your system. So apologies to everybody. No, it's now back.
That's fantastic. There's a little bit of, my heart's going a little bit faster. Anyway, so back to where we were. Three set parts for today. I'm going to start with some introductions, some scene setting. We're then going to progress to the scenario itself. And the way it works, very exciting, is you, the audience, are the members of a board of a fictional company, Eat Well PLC. And that company is transitioning to net zero. And you're going to be asked to vote on various dilemmas, votes in board meetings. And it's a 10-year scenario starting in 2022. And the voting is really important for the success of the event. So do please take a minute and do vote. That's what makes it actually fun. And once you vote, there's going to be an outcome. And then the panel is going to reflect on that vote and the outcome. And then hopefully there's a lot of learnings. At the end, we'll have reflections from the expert panel, and it's a chance for you to pose them questions as well. Okay, right. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by this fantastic lineup of panelists today. We have Catherine David, who's the Director of Collaboration and Change at WRAP, a climate action NGO working to tackle the causes of climate change. We've got Silke Goldberg, who's a partner at Herbert Smith Freehills. John Hopner, who's the head of US Stewardship and Sustainable Investment at Elgin. And David Tyler, who's the chair of Domestic and General, and he was the former chair of Sainsbury's. So before we get into the scenario itself, I want to run a poll, make sure the technology is working, and also to get a sense of the level of expertise that you think that your own companies are at. So this will provide a little bit of context for today. Now, some of you will be on multiple boards, so maybe just pick the board that you've been on for the longest time. So how would you describe your firm in terms of the level of expertise? Do you think in terms of climate sort of strategic competence or whatever, you're just compliant? That is a company that is disposed to and acting according to mandatory or legal requirements. So you're doing the minimum, but you're not necessarily going beyond that in terms of climate at the moment. Do you think you're responsible? That's a bit more advanced. It's a company that understands the climate risks and opportunities associated with your business, and you have governance measures in place to manage them. Do you think you're even more advanced? Do you think you're a leader, a company that has set ambitious goals to transition to net zero by 2050 or sooner, and you've got a robust investment plan in place to achieve it? Or do you think you're a pioneer? This is a company that has transformed their business strategy, their investment decision-making process, the products and services you offer, and you are on track to deliver 50% of emission cuts across your value chain by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2050. So what do you think you are? Be honest about it. But then, yeah, I think it will be interesting because today is all about this fictitious company who, well, let us put it, they're not kind of really on the scale at the moment. They've got a little way to go. Okay, so I'm going to leave it just another few seconds while more of you submit. You're probably thinking, I don't know. I don't know how advanced we really are. Just give it a go. And then we will reveal the results. And hopefully I won't get kicked off this panel. There's something about doing scenario games because this happened once before. Something about working with Chapter Zero. Okay, right. I think we have quite a few responses, so let's take a look. Right. So I don't know, Julie, if you want to comment at all on what you're expecting. I mean, we've got the bulk of companies there, over 50% as responsible. Perhaps that's where the most firms are at the moment. Just under 2% as pioneers. That wouldn't surprise me. And then a third compliant. I don't know if you've got any comments you want to add, Julie.
Just to say that I think that's probably a fairly typical spread from the things that we've looked at recently. And I suspect if we'd done it a year ago, the blue bar at the top would have been a lot longer. And if we do it in a year's time, I suspect the red bar at the bottom will be a lot longer. So a good idea to have that understanding of where the audience is coming from.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, now we know where we are kind of in real life. Let's get on to the scenario itself, navigating the transition to net zero. So I've told you how it's going to work. Just to remind you, the audience, are the members of the board of E12 PLC, and you're going to be asked to vote. There'll be 4 votes over a 10-year scenario, and you're going to be helped by a panel of experts. This slide gives you a few key statistics about Eat Well PLC. It's primarily a food company, a food production and distribution company, with an annual turnover of around £80 billion. We employ 250,000 staff across the globe. We're headquartered in the UK. Our three main divisions cover the food and beverage industry, the small healthcare. We have a small healthcare and nutrition unit, and a transport and logistics arm to get our products to market. We have a large and diverse product range that can be found in supermarkets all around the world. And Eat Well is a significant emitter, both in terms of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, due to the emissions-intensive nature of food. But there are significant Scope 3 emissions up and down our value chain, and that's concentrated in farming and food waste. You can see from the slide we have over 3,000 suppliers, so a very complex supply chain. And one thing to note, though, a bit of context for you, is that although there's a lot of talk in the media about consumers valuing sustainable products, Eat Well has found it difficult to communicate with customers about the sustainability credentials of a product. And so I think basically overall, the shift in values that we see, that we think that consumers are experiencing, isn't really reflected in any great extent in their purchasing habits in our major markets. That's just a little bit of context for you. So this is the timeline for today's scenario. We're going to start in this year, 2022, and then on to 3 further dilemmas up to 2030. And just remember, by 2030, we need, collectively as a planet, to have halved global emissions to keep 1.5 degree warming alive. And that's only about 80 board meetings away, so no time to waste, basically. So let's kick off with the first scenario, the first bit of the scenario. Now we're going to start, I'm going to give you a little bit of background up to the first vote, which is in November, but we're going to start in early 2022. Now, this is the context. So Eat Well PLC is lagging behind its competitors. The company hasn't yet made a full net zero commitment. There are no interim goals or formal transition plan yet. Now, given that the company is a significant emitter and is being outpaced by its competitors, there is mounting pressure coming from a range of stakeholders. You've got NGOs, climate activists, even shareholders, and they're pushing us to publish a full net zero transition plan as soon as possible. And it's starting to impact on our reputation. Now, given all this, the CEO announces a commitment to publish a full net zero commitment before the end of 2022. And that's going to be accompanied by a detailed transition plan of how to get there. So work begins in the spring within the company. And unfortunately, it rapidly becomes apparent that Eat Well doesn't really have the necessary data to create a credible strategy and plan. So there's a lot of catching up to do, particularly just to set that baseline. And also, geopolitical events are making the company question its underlying strategy more generally. So a little bit more context. The Ukrainian conflict has caused significant disruption to the company's supply chain through the summer, especially for wheat. It's created numerous challenges for logistics and procurement. And we've experienced heat waves as well. As we move into the summer, we have drought and several wheat harvests are hit around the world. Now, this places strain on the firm and means that the net zero project goals get squeezed. They get squeezed for resources, and now it's running late. Perhaps a familiar story for those of you who are trying to organise this kind of transition. Given that the pressure to publish remains as high as ever, the board, that's you need to decide how to respond. So this is the first of your votes in the game. Do we publish the full net zero target, that's scope 1, 2 and 3, but with conservative interim goals and no comprehensive transition plan. So that's something that we think is quite manageable. Or do we announce that the publication of a full net zero commitment and transition plan will be delayed by 9 months due to the unexpected difficulties that the firm has faced this year? So what are you going to do? You should vote now. I guess the way to think about this is, in terms of the first option here, we do have achievable set of interim dates, but they are pretty conservative. They're not really ambitious. And you should be aware that the resources that we have available for doing the work haven't been able to complete a full baseline of the company's emissions. So we can't really work out if we could be more ambitious or not. The transition plan is definitely work in progress. The team they really feel that they're many months away from being able to publish this. And I think this really points to sort of lack of resourcing, lack of skills within the company to really take this on. We are on the back foot, to put it mildly. So we're getting the votes in. Maybe some of you have been faced with this kind of dilemma in your own companies. Like how ambitious do you want to be? And of course, is your reputation at stake either way if you go quickly or not quickly enough. Right. So I think we've got quite a few of the results in. So let's take a look at the board vote. Okay, well this is great actually, because it's fairly evenly balanced, which is always more fun, I think. So I'm going to make a note of this. 48% of you or so want to publish the conservative plan, the conservative interim goals, but no comprehensive transition plan. And then 52% of you want to delay. You want to get it all perfect. So, okay, I think that gives our panel quite something to talk about in a while. Let me talk to you about the response to that, though. So I'm going to tell you the response to both votes because there's like 50-50 almost. So for those of you who voted for doing the less detailed response, the lack of a transition plan undermines the credibility of the interim targets. The commitment itself is considered unambitious, especially in the context of industry peers who have forged ahead. Now, those of you who decided you wanted to delay, well, unfortunately, it's not that great for you either, because you're criticised for delaying what is considered an already slow response to the climate crisis. So I'm afraid in either case, the actions of the firm sort of cement its position as a laggard in the industry. The perception is that the firm isn't taking the issue seriously enough, and that results in increased scrutiny from shareholders, the media, and other pressure groups. Now, the board members, you, decide to complete the Chapter 0 scorecard to assess their overall climate approach. And through doing the process, they obviously learn a great deal about themselves, and bruised by the external kind of reaction, they agree to set themselves the ambition to become sector leaders in climate. So, we're on the right track, or are we? So I'm going to turn to our panel and see what do they make of all this. So can I start with you, Catherine? What did you make of the dilemma and the vote?
Thank you, Julie. Very interesting to see the split. And I guess what this is showing is that it's clear that setting the right net zero target is really key. It focuses attention internally and can be very motivational, but also with stakeholders. So there's obviously a real desire to do this clearly and transparently and to set the intention. But it's pretty important this intention is at the right level of ambition and is backed up by data and by the transition plan. And indeed, I mean, you mentioned in your setup that there's a senior level commitment needed, but also investment in the skills and capacity to make that change happen. I think as a food business, Eat Well is going to need to focus on its scope 3. And so identifying the key supply chain partners and engaging these partners on those targets as part of this transition plan is going to be crucial. And it's also going to be really important to think about implications for Eat Well's product portfolio, what the investment and innovation priorities need to be, and how future business growth is aligned to this transition plan and business emissions reduction goals. And then finally, I'd say, there's also a whole load of considerations about downstream retail customers and consumers who are going to want to know about Eat Well's intentions and scrutinise their action. So quite a few considerations here in this scenario. And I think Eat Well would also be well advised to be open to engaging with pre-competitive platforms and NGO partners to help Eat Well play that catch-up game and develop their capability.
Wise words there. Thank you very much, Catherine. Right, I'm going to turn to David next, please.
Oh, well, thanks, Jo. Well, firstly, I quite understand that the 50-50 sort of vote that we just had happened. I don't think any of us wanted to vote for either, really. Frankly, if it was me voting, I would firmly be in the camp of vote the second option. I think the target, the company's already got issues, is going to exacerbate them by going off half-cocked, by just giving a conservative target date for net zero and no transition plan. So as you rightly said, there'd be no credibility there at all. So I would firmly be saying, if I was involved in this company, let's put up with a day's bad publicity, maybe a little bit more, but absolutely ensure that we set a new target date and not just reach it, but beat it. So we start changing the climate of opinion about our climate policy, which at the moment is lousy, understandably. So I would be saying, let's put together that high quality team of our own people and of experts from outside, get them working straight away, keep a very close monitoring eye on that process, and aim them to get this new statement out with a credible transition plan and a proper target date within 6 months, having said 9, and at least this case, under promise and then over deliver. So that's my response.
Brilliant. Okay. What about you, John? What would you have done?
And I'm glad David went in front of me. So I'm very much thinking about this from my, investor perspective. And I'm surprised by that 50-50 outcome. I would have voted for one. I know we're not supposed to vote. We're supposed to opine on the vote. I would have voted for the first outcome. And what I see is I'm thinking a lot about our investor base and how do we keep our investor base comfortable? Because I know that, unfortunately, the end consumers and even the media and NGOs, there's this huge asymmetry of information. We know exactly how our net zero, how difficult it is for us and how the plan will evolve. But in general, there might be some noise around the media or NGOs, but really we're the only ones who understand our plan. And so we're ultimately going to get boxed in by having a plan or not having a plan. And it'll be a 1 or a 0 binary decision that a lot of our investor community is going to follow. And so I've been on the phone very often, and I hear the defense that we're waiting, we're delaying, but you're just getting a 0. So we'll miss out kind of those investors that want to see the beginnings of a commitment. I also know that having kind of targets changing over time is really important. So having a no target is quite painful for those investors who are looking at us. So for me, I'd be very much in that camp of 1, but understand it. So those are some reflections. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, John. It just shows, doesn't it, that even the experts have different views. Silke, how about you? What's your opinion on this?
Thank you. So I think from a legal perspective, there are a number of things that we could take apart here. For me, the key concern in relation to the dilemma 1 was that the company did not actually know what its carbon footprint was. So therefore, any goals that it would have set would have been quite wobbly in terms of the scientific backup. So the first rule in all of this, know thy company. So know your what's your output, what are your emissions, and then set the targets in relation to that. From a legal perspective, I think it was David who said under-promise and over-deliver. That's probably a good strategy, because from one of the risks that we're seeing here is companies who over-promise in their sustainability strategy, and then very quickly we are in the territory of greenwashing, and the company and criticism, it will then not just be from in terms of reputation, but it could well have legal consequences as well. So therefore, that's always something to take into consideration as well.
Excellent. Okay, well, that was dilemma 1. We're going to move on to dilemma 2 now, which is all to do with carbon offsets. So let's turn to the run-up to it in 2023. So the board wants to position Eat Well as a climate leader. Just remember that we've set ambitious. That's a company that will have set ambitious goals and have a robust investment plan to get there. So in 2023, we publish a full net zero commitment alongside a comprehensive transition plan. And these plans include ambitious short-term emissions reduction goals, 55% reduction by 2030, and an overall net zero commitment by 2045. Now, the firm is trying to catch up on lost time. So the problem is that those short-term reduction targets have really been set at a pretty unrealistic pace. And we know that the failure to meet the first target would be a terrible blow to our credibility. So the firm is looking for a remedy, and that's going to be a significant use of offsets. So by March 2024, it's absolutely clear to us that carbon offsets are going to be needed to meet the initial targets, which is for a 15% reduction across the firm. Now, essentially, we've not had time to make any changes to our energy sourcing and manufacturing processes. Now, few of the directors actually know really very much about offsets. So we get a presentation from a consulting firm who specialises in offsets, and the board goes along with it. We purchase 500,000 tonnes, $30 per tonne, so we're outlaying 15 million tonnes. The annual report is published in 2024 in May, and that announces our initial targets have been met. Now, the initial reaction is overall positive. In the annual report, there's also detail of remuneration targets. Now, the Remuneration Committee has set out some long-term incentive plan targets which will pay out in 2027. But there is considerable comment from investors that the performance targets for those investment plans are not stretching enough to justify 20% of the payment available, particularly if they're relying on offsetting. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, unfortunately, we then enter a bit of a media storm. After we announced that we'd met those initial emissions targets, a number of climate activist groups are suspicious of the quick turnaround, and they start to investigate the claims in our annual report. And by September 2024, an expose piece is published in the Financial Times, which contains research by the World Wildlife Fund on carbon reduction schemes and the use of offsetting. Now, the research discredits the company's largest source of offsets, which is a tree planting scheme in South America. And that's been underperforming in terms of carbon sequestration. And even worse, it's actually been causing damage to biodiversity in the area. Well, the press sees on the use of offsets in general, and Eat Well finds itself at the centre of a controversy that rumbles on through the rest of the year. And we know we need to get a grip on this. So we look for external advice from expert consultancies. And the consultants that we get in are actually very good, and they explain an approach to offsetting called insetting. So a little bit confusing, but insetting is basically, it involves the funding of the implementation of nature-based solutions within your own supply chain. So it covers things like reforestation, agroforestry, regenerative agriculture, that sort of thing. It means collaborating with firms within the supply chain to fund decarbonise efforts, and then those projects are validated by an impartial third party. Now, there are a lot of benefits to this approach. So first of all, it contributes to the reduction of our Scope 3 emissions. It also strengthens relations with and the resilience of our supply chain. And of course, Eat Well will be credited with the creation of our own carbon offsets. So it seems like a really good thing to do. So now, of course, we need to vote on it. Are we going to develop this collaborative insetting approach with leading experts, and then we focus on the opportunities for emissions reductions and resilience through Eat Well's supply chain, and then we will get it validated by this impartial third party? Or do you think I've had enough of insetting, offsetting, all of that business? I want the executive to focus just on removing absolute emissions within our own operations. That's going to minimise the need for offsets. We can buy any carbon offsets just to make up the difference. So what of these two options do you really want to do? The benefit, of course, with the insetting approach is that you get these high quality offsets. It doesn't really do anything at all for your own Scope 1 and Scope 2. But of course, it has a major benefit for Scope 3, and it improves the resilience of the supply chain. I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, I'd really quite like to do both, but I'm afraid we don't have the resources to do both, so you're going to have to decide one way or the other. And you're probably thinking, I don't have enough information to make this decision, but then that's the nature of the scenario game. And I'm sure many of you have sat in board meetings and thought, I'd really like a lot more information, but time is pressing and you just got to go with something. So keep your votes coming. And we've seen already that, fairly evenly balanced. I'll be fascinated to see how this one goes. Is it going to be as equally balanced? I'm just having a look and seeing how many people have voted. I can also have a sneak preview at the vote, which is quite fun. Okay, we've got 60%, or 70% of the votes in. Any last thoughts? Okay. If you haven't managed to vote, I'm going to close the voting now, and let's have a look. Okay, so far more of you like the insetting approach. Maybe I was selling it a little bit harder than the other one. I don't know. I was trying to be impartial. Okay, so I'm going to switch the order around a little bit. And John, let's start with you.
Sure. In this one, this is a really tough dilemma. I'm focused in on the year of 2024. And so if you've committed to being a leader, I think part of leadership is trying to push to these new systems, new processes. So I think the insetting approach, today's world, you don't actually get much credit for the reduction of Scope 3, but I think frameworks are evolving. So for me, I think I would go with one, and I'm excited to see most are there. And I think that number 2 is kind of table stakes. So I think if you have, as a leader, you have to push for that first scenario, first option. Thanks.
Okay, fine. How about you, Silke?
So this is an interesting one, and this perhaps needs to be contextualized with dilemma 1. So I would be, sort of full declaration up front, probably be in the second case. Many clients who come to me discuss offsetting, insetting, innovative approaches. They definitely have their place. However, what this company, Eat Well, has done, they have used it as a quick fix. And it was interesting what you said in your lead, and you said, the company didn't really have time to make changes. And that combined with the company having lots of unprecedented difficulties, those two together suggest to me the company hasn't really made the decision to become a leader. So they're looking for quick fixes. They haven't thought about their strategy and how they're going to approach climate change and the relevant pressures and required changes as a whole. So the difficulty with insetting and offsetting is always the standard, the level of verification, and ultimately in relation to offsetting, there's always the risk that you don't actually remove emissions from from the atmosphere, but it's preliminary or primarily a calculation matter, and statistical removal. So if Eat Well wants to become a leader in climate change and in carbon removal, then I think directing the executive to become focused on removing absolute emissions is the pioneering or the clear way ahead. Perhaps also you mentioned that in relation to remuneration. Some companies, what we've seen, they link annual or biannual emission reduction target to directors' pay. So if a company did something like that, then they could position themselves as a clear leader in this context. Thank you.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you very much, Silke. It was really good advice there. David, how about you?
Well, again, it's a tough call, and that's reflected in the vote you got there. I again, find it difficult in this environment because in the real world, you probably are going to do both, and you're just going to balance them up in some way or other. But given this business is a huge global business with a massive supply chain. Just look at the scale of it from what you had in your introduction, Joe. And Scope 3 emissions are going to be vastly more than their Scope 1 and 2, I suspect. And so I think for the long term, we've got to think about the long term here. If I was the director of this company, I'd be focusing on that Scope 3 because we can always continue to work on Scope 1 and 2 a bit more straightforwardly. There's lots of clear things to do there. And bringing our own supply chain with us here to deepen our relationship with them and enhance our relationship with them, and being very clear to them the way we want to go over these next 6 years to 2030 when we set our targets to get to zero or whenever it happens to be. I think that's really important. And getting into the detail, whatever the background noise is that you've just talked about, getting into the detail about some of these offset schemes or inset schemes in this case, the regenerative agriculture will be very, very key here in terms of us reducing carbon over the long term. So I'd want us to get on and focus on that above all. I really don't want to lose too much on our Scope 1 and 2, but if I had to make a choice, I'm with the first one here and focusing on that insetting.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. And Catherine, how about you?
So I guess firstly, just to say the priority must be on emissions reductions. So, neither offsetting nor insetting in a way should distract from that focus on the net zero ambition and goal. However, I agree with David that as a food business, insetting can be a really useful way to businesses to engage in and fund decarbonisation activities in their supply chains. And this is going to be most effective if it's really well integrated into Eat Well's core sourcing, supply chain relationships, and with an eye to the overall impacts of such programs. So not just the GHG reductions, but also other dimensions, including nature and social impacts. And there are many expert NGOs and pre-competitive platforms in different commodities here that can help advise and shape strategy. I think insetting could also be a way for Eat Well to better understand their GHG footprint, so to get better data rather than using average data sets, get kind of real granular data on some of their key high GHG footprint products, and build capability in the business. And finally, just to say that I think if insetting programs are done well, they can also be the source of impact evidence and stories, which can help bring Eat Well's net zero plans to life a bit with its customers and consumers, and support that sort of leadership positioning from a brand perspective.
Great. Okay, so quite a few of you quite like the insetting approach there, as does the audience. So let's see what the response was. Well, if you'd voted for the insetting approach, well, the reaction is it's actually considered a smart approach and an efficient way of meeting a number of goals. It allows the firm to meet carbon reduction targets, at least in Scope 3, whilst you've got the longer term investments are made to reduce overall emissions from Scope 1 and Scope 2. The good thing about insetting is alongside those Scope 3 emission reductions, you can strengthen the relationship with your suppliers, and you can build resilience across your supply chain. And as David noted, we've got a massive and complex supply chain. For those of you who voted option 2, which is to focus on absolute emission removals, well, given the limited funds and the longer term nature of this type of decarbonisation effort, you quickly would have realised that actually it's not significantly going to move the dial on the overall emissions levels in the short term. And so with the next round of emissions reduction milestones looming, you would have been focusing on sourcing good quality offsets anyway, and then you'd have actually been forced to adopt some sort of in-setting approach there just because of the time pressures. So how does Eat Well respond? Well, we've decided we need to boost our efforts through upskilling. We appoint an experienced head of sustainability, about time too, probably. And the next round of emissions reduction targets are met, in large part due to the success of the in-setting scheme. And over the following year, the company creates numerous partnered projects that are externally validated, and they're actively supporting our emissions reduction targets. The good thing is we're also building resilience across the supply chain, and all of that is very well received. I think we also just kind of a little bit of context here as well. The company is commended by various NGOs for using the company's position to support real change through the supply chain. And the perception around the company actually starts to shift. Okay, so I think we've actually gone through this already, probably the wrong way round, haven't we? Let's move on to dilemma 3. So we're going to look now at the cost of carbon. And we're going to start in May of 2027. And this is following the publication of our 2026 annual report. The latest round of emission reductions have been met, but commentators still think that we are overly reliant on offsets. That is the offsets we've created in our supply chain through our in-setting programme, just to be clear. Our absolute Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions remain higher than they should be at this stage of the transition to net zero. But also, Eat Well's using an internal carbon price, which is lagging behind industry peers. So at this point, the company is basing its calculations on an internal carbon price of a little bit over $100 per tonne. It's also built in very little leeway into the finances should the price rise above this. Now, our competitors, we think, are using levels of nearer to $150 per tonne when assessing their investments. Also, the company hasn't been using any scenario analysis in any meaningful sense. So they've no real understanding of how much a higher carbon price would actually hurt them. Well, during 2027, there are a series of catastrophic climate-induced physical risk events. One example of this, which hits us particularly hard, is a series of flooding, followed by drought, and then further flooding. And that is a particularly devastating weather combination for communities, infrastructure, and crops. And it's concentrated in a region where we have many active suppliers. Now, thankfully, some of the work that has taken place with our suppliers as part of our in-setting approach has started to pay real dividends in terms of building resilience. And that means that actually we as a company with our supply chain navigate this particular physical risk event relatively well. Unfortunately, many others in the region don't fare so well. And what's worse is that there are other events across the world, devastating heat waves, floods, and a very significant loss of life. Now, this is context for COP32, which takes place in November 2027. And that catastrophic flooding and the drought and the heat waves really has proven to be a catalyst needed to drive the implementation of a global carbon tax. Now, we don't know at what level it's going to be set, but even though Eat Well has managed the physical risks pretty well, considering, certainly it lags its competitors on the cost of carbon that it's assuming for internal planning purposes. So at this stage, we're not sure what level the carbon tax is going to be introduced, but we're in a board meeting just after COP32, and we're invited to vote. What are we going to do with our carbon tax? Are we going to increase the internal carbon price, rather, to $150 for all our investment decisions? Now, that will align us with the industry practice, and we think that that will make sure that our investments deliver the targets set out in our business case. Or actually, are we a bit more mindful about the context, and we do think we need to be a bit more ambitious? Are we going to insist that the executives apply a carbon price of over $250 for all the investment decisions to reflect anticipated future increases? Now, if we go for that higher price, that's certainly going to make some of our activities unviable going forward. Now, bear in mind with this one, we don't know what level it will be introduced. Politicians have announced their intention. Currently, carbon is trading at around $80 to $100. And the consensus is that the tax might increase to around 150 to 250, possibly a little higher. But it's very uncertain, and you need to make the decision now because it's the budget round and we need to kind of start getting this integrated into our decision making. So what are you going to do? So I think a lot of you are thinking, this is really hard. I don't really have enough information to make this decision, but I'm going to give you a few more, just a minute more or so. Anybody in the panel who wants to comment, let me know while we let people vote. Otherwise, we'll just give people a bit of time. And I'll try and get the...
Joe, that even in today's board meetings, certainly what I'm observing is there's a big debate going on, now about what cost of carbon should be included in our investment appraisals. And just recently, someone suggested it should be $200 today. So, I mean, it's a very interesting aspect of how we appraise, particularly capital investments going forward.
Yeah, no, it's a difficult one. And you can imagine the boardroom in 2027 with all these devastating events and a lot of political will to introduce it. There's also a reputational issue here as well on how ambitious you want to be. You've been caught out before. What are you going to do? So how hard-nosed do you think our audience are going to be here? How commercial? Okay, I think we will go to reveal. Okay, so this is interesting. We have more of you wanting to go for 150. I'm going to make a note of this. Just under 59%. And 41% of you really want to go for the higher price. So let me tell you the outcome rather than get the panelists in too early like I did last time. So if you voted for $150, well, actually, the carbon price set by the policymakers is going to be $200. So investors asked the company how they arrived at 150, and they challenged the board's judgment, whether you're really understanding the consequences, the kind of the context that you're operating in, and that you really understand the political environment as much as any. If you voted for $250, well, that will turn many of the company's previous decisions upside down. Investors actually are a little bit alarmed by the radical conclusions coming from the $250 carbon price, which we weren't expecting. But they do recognise that actually the reality is not that far short of it. Now, the company now you're in a bit of a dilemma. Bring in some experts to run a board away day. And what these experts do is they help you understand the illustration, the implications rather of different scenarios and how resilient the company is to withstand those different scenarios. And it's clear that the board still lacks the requisite expertise. Investors, meanwhile, beginning to doubt our ability to deliver the net zero plan. We have a consistent underperformance of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emission reductions. The target set for the long-term incentive plans in 2023, if you remember, they sort of made sense at the time. They looked distinctly unambitious in the present context. They failed to keep up with the need for increasing ambition, and now they've paid out. Now, this greatly frustrates many investors, and they put pressure on the chairman to increase the board and executive capability and expertise needed to make these judgments. So we find we have 2 new non-executive directors are appointed with sustainability and climate understanding. One takes over as the chair of the Sustainability Committee, and they bring on the CFO and the CRO all as members. So that's a really good development. And they hoped that they want to bring climate and other ESG considerations firmly into all BAU business decision making. So a good outcome there in a way. But what does our panel think? Is it enough? Let me start with you, David.
Well, thank you very much. You've really given me the short straw there, Jo. I mean, this is really where the rubber hits the road in my view. Because what's the company for? In the end, it's to provide a return on investment for its investors. Of course, employ lots of people and do good for society. But the danger here is if we start using a carbon price of $250, which I think is in the second option we've got, we're simply going to conclude that we've got to stop producing a huge number of our products. That's got 2 negative implications, apart from the obvious, which is profit. It will throw the door open to our competitors who don't take such a radical view on the carbon price and allow them to steal our business, because we've basically moved out of it because we thought the price was going to go even higher. Clearly it's going to undermine the ongoing profitability and sustainability of the company. Now, on the other hand, you don't want to have a carbon price that's too low, and we're only offered this $150. But if I really had only the choice of one or the other, I'd go for the 150 at this point and keep looking at it on a regular basis, certainly annually, because this is it's going to be such an important point. But I had to do one or the other, I'd be using the 150 now. If I had the option, and you haven't really given us this here, I'd be dividing our products into 2, being very clear about those of which are going to be unviable at some point because of the increasing cost of carbon, and those that will still be viable even if the cost of carbon went that high, and then using different prices against each. Now, that may be a bit of an unfair answer, but if I had to, I'd be voting one. If I could do, I'd be doing that more subtle piece. But this is really, as I say, the point, and you've got it in 2027 here, I think, where companies are going to be up against it in real terms. You've just talked about all those people who've lost their lives in recent months in the environment you set out in 2027. Consumers are beginning to be really alarmed, so is everybody. And boards really going to have to think very, very carefully at that point. So everything we're doing in a way is approaching this sort of point, which perhaps in your estimation might be 5 years away. Oh, maybe it will be. That's sort of final point, which is an obvious one, is actually it's very difficult to know what the right carbon price is. In January 2022, we had a very different view about what the right carbon price would be than March 2022, post the Putin invasion of Ukraine. So difficult to have an easy answer to these things, isn't it? Because the world changes. Thanks.
Yeah, no, fair enough, David. And it is very black and white, but that's partly so that we get a response. Okay, let's turn to Catherine.
I think to build on what David was saying, product portfolio understanding is clearly going to be key. And I think this 2027 scenario is helping make the case for why it's better to do that sooner rather than later. So that's one point. And also just to say that the way that you described that scenario is pretty horrifying, isn't it? And we distill it into a decision about carbon pricing, but really the implications for Eatwell's overall business in terms of its supply chain, employees, customers is clearly massive. I think my view here is that by this point, it should be clear to the Eatwell board that it is better to go for a future orientation as far as it possibly can. And I think to look to adopt the higher carbon price, although I think David's idea is quite interesting of applying that on a portfolio basis. I think the ramping up of extreme weather events, the impacts on the business, the political context, they all point for me to getting ahead of the game because things are only going to get worse and probably at pace. And so really Eatwell needs to get a shift on and reshape key parts of its business to the new and emerging reality. It's not just a decision about investment, it's about the whole orientation of the business and whether we are transforming Eatwell into one business which is ready for that decarbonised world. So yeah, I feel like this is a kind of key decision point moment for Eatwell about the kind of business it wants to be and whether it is going to proactively shift its product portfolio ahead of carbon pricing, forcing that hand, and most likely jumping on a consumer opportunity where consumers will, I think by this stage themselves, be looking for those lower carbon alternatives.
Yeah, a really good point. Like, we don't actually know what our consumers are thinking at this stage, but they're probably pretty horrified. Silky, how about you, the legal perspective?
Thank you. There are a couple of legal points that I would like to make, but there's a broader point which is really important, which has a legal angle to it. 3 points really. So you don't often hear lawyers discussing pricing or the commerciality of a particular decision. We tend to get into legal details and how sort of certain things fit with the law and how they fit with an overall strategy. And perhaps this is the point here as well. So I have many clients who in their sustainability reports aim to put forward a particular carbon price. And the key thing that I always ask is, how have you arrived at this price? How does your board understand the deep impact that this may have on your activities? And importantly, how will you apply it? There's no use having a very high carbon price, but not applying it systematically and not sort of being accountable for internally as well as externally how one applies this. First of all, so that goes to, does the board really understand what it means to have an internal carbon price? But it might go to profit, it might go to types of activity, and it really is a systemic decision that the board is taking there. The second point is sort of related to that. So what does it mean to have a carbon price? Sort of how will the board apply this? And sort of will it do so regularly? That's my third point. Carbon pricing, this came out of the discussion already, has the tendency to evolve. What was a good carbon price and an acceptable carbon price perhaps 2 years ago is no longer the carbon price in the market right now. Just look, for instance, at the development of the EU ETS, how that has sort of, and the trajectory of the ton of carbon there, or the UK ETS, the UK emission trading scheme, the European Union emission trading scheme. So make a commitment as a board, perhaps more so than the actual price. Look at to review it on a regular basis and whether that price at a particular point in time is still aligned with what you want to achieve as a board.
Fantastic, thank you. And John, can we just get your views on this, please?
Sure. Briefly on this one, many good points, fellow board members. I think the thing that I see is the speed at which things have to be reset. So the expectation would be that you're running scenario plans as a board at many different prices all the way along the way. So, $100, $250 shouldn't be a surprise, right? And so all of that should be well thought out. And I really like David's idea of kind of setting product by by profitability, based on different assumptions. But so at a minimum, you need that scenario planning for sure. I agree with Silke that the investment community will have its own pricing, and it'll be very dynamic. It'll be almost updated on a daily basis, the expectations. Again, to what David said, if you think about just, over a matter of months, the pricing assumptions in the market shifted so much. So I think what will have to happen is that the company needs to be much more dynamic. It's nothing like setting it for a few years and then retesting it. It's almost, every board meeting, how are things shifting? And lastly, I think one thing none of us mentioned, which would be very concerning to the investment community, is CEO pay structures that are linked to meeting various objectives. Again, it would be laughable in 27 to be getting paid out on targets set 4 years ago. Now, that's very different than what investors normally say. Investors normally say, I want to see firm payment, and then it to be you stay to that same pay structure over a period of time, don't adjust it. But something's going to change where if we know it wouldn't be related to price on carbon, it would have to be related to absolute reduction, something you can't control in the same way. Whereas if it's related to price on carbon and your ability to offset it, would just have much different implications. So I think the big point that I would see is just the pace of resetting and scenario planning would have to drastically increase. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, well, that was a very rich discussion, and we are going to move on now to fourth and final dilemma, which is in 2030. So the IPCC at this stage has just released its latest comprehensive assessment, and it shows that carbon emissions have fallen by only 30% globally. That's well below the 50% target needed to protect 1.5 degree warming. Meanwhile, global average temperatures have reached 1.4 degrees. Policymakers then agree to shift towards setting sector-specific emissions reductions targets. They're definitely getting a lot more desperate for action. And within sectors, targets are going to be set by each firm's ability to bear the costs. So the food and agricultural sectors are amongst those under greater pressure to transition faster. And Eat Well is actually picked out as a potential leader in this regard because of our progress since 2026, particularly across our supply chain. Now, at Eat Well, our new NED appointments and the shift in strategy has actually stood us well. We've established world-leading efforts to build resilience and lower emissions through our supply chain. But our 2045 net zero target, now only 15 years away, remains extremely challenging. And it's clear that action needs to be much faster, much more extensive, if we're going to have a hope of protecting 2 degrees. Now, our employees are very aware of this, and they're making demands for more radical changes. And there's growing external expectation that as a leading and still profitable firm, we should be approaching net zero very soon. Consumer awareness has grown. They're pressurising firms, especially in food and fashion. And there's a good deal more climate activism now. So the environment definitely has changed from the beginning of the scenario. Climate litigation is on the rise very rapidly. And there have been quite a lot of AGM votes against boards or individual directors. For example, chairs have been voted against for lack of strategic direction, audit chairs for incorrect reporting, remuneration chairs for inappropriate incentives, sustainability committee chairs for lack of leadership. So you're all going to be a little bit on edge at the moment because the world is very different in 2030. So what is the dilemma we're going to face now? Well, we're struggling still to reduce our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions to the levels demanded by our emissions reduction plan. We're at 40% already, but we should be at 55%. Particularly across a few hard-to-abate lines of high volume, often highly processed goods that we continue to offer. And due to the emissions intensity that comes from factory farming and high-volume production facilities, a number of our staples, such as beef mince, sausage rolls, crisps, for example, are problematic. And the problem is that these goods have been really big profit makers for the company over the years. because you've got high volume and you've still got continuous strong consumer demand. So it appears, curiously, that there is still a demand for those products, despite that broader, more austere attitude, particularly across the younger consumers. Now, the main dilemma for us is focused on whether or not the company axes these less green but still highly profitable lines of business. We do expect high demand for these staples to continue, but it's impossible to reduce those emissions associated with them in a way that would align the products with the company's overall climate ambitions. We've just got to the end of the road. There's just, in the time that we've got left, there isn't enough time to knock those last emissions out. So in other words, we've got a real dilemma. Those products are increasingly at odds with our green and sustainable credentials. So here we have the last dilemma. What are you going to do? We're in a board meeting, just to remind you, we're now in mid-May 2030. We have to make a decision, and the decision needs to be made now ahead of announcement at the upcoming AGM later in the year. Are you going to continue these lines of business, keep current financial performance on track? This certainly would be the less disruptive of the options, but it would fall short of expectations for emissions reductions, and it would damage our green credentials. Or are you going to stick to the greener route, and you're going to close those lines of business pretty quickly? You're going to meet the emissions reductions targets. You're certainly going to face a short-term hit to profits. There will be layoffs, and there will also be the need to accelerate the transition to a new, more sustainable suite of products. So that's the dilemma. That's the final dilemma. Try and put yourself in the mind of somebody in 2030. You've gone through this quite a turbulent few years. Just to let you know that from what we can gather, the shareholders are fairly split on the decision. Some certainly continue to prioritise short-term profits. Others, though, seem to be much happier to see a dip in short-term returns in order to continue the transition properly. I think there's more growing awareness across a lot of the investors that the risks of not fully transitioning are substantial. From the board's perspective, on a going concern basis, the axing of these highly profitable product lines, they will stress the company, but Eatwell will absolutely be able to navigate this financially. So it's not like we're voting for something that's going to ultimately ruin the company. It's just, what's the balance here? Are we going to maintain financial performance, or are you going to take that hit? Okay, so we're getting the votes in. Julie, anything that you want to add at this stage while we wait for people to vote?
I think one of the interesting points which has come up through the panel is about boards thinking ahead and timing and trying to get a sense of what direction of travel, of the context they're going to be working in. So I think that would inform this. If this company had got going earlier, they wouldn't be in this dilemma. And the other thing that I really think comes out of this particular one is this climate thinking needs to be embedded throughout organizations. It's not just something that one committee or one sustainability lead with some people supporting them is going to be doing. This is in finance, it's in strategy, it's in internal audit, it's in operations. And if it's embedded properly through the organization, then you get a lot more feedback coming through from the shop floor or from the sort of wider reaches of the business to help inform the board on these decisions. Because I think sometimes the people at the sharp end are closer to this than the board itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And as you say, if only they'd got on with it sooner, but it would have been a rather boring scenario if they'd been absolutely brilliant throughout. Okay, so let's take a look and see what the vote is. Oh, look at that. The least marginal of all of them. So you've really got into this green thing now. The 78% of you want to close those business lines quickly, and just 22% of you want to carry on and maintain financial performance. That's really interesting and quite different from what we've had so far. So let me just tell you the outcome of those votes. Well, for those of you who voted to continue the lines, this actually prompts the resignation of the climate activist board members. We face outcry from some of the activist shareholders, and we face accusations of putting profit over planet. The share price does take a significant hit, and ultimately we actually have to do a U-turn over the decision. So we end up having to close down some of those more carbon-intensive business lines anyway. Had you voted for option 2, which nearly 80% of you did, just bear in mind one large shareholder did offload the stock. They weren't happy with the result. But generally, investors were pretty supportive of it. We get a lot of positive press. The decision is seen as a case of putting planet before profit. We do, though, however, experience a short-term fall in the share price, and our profits do suffer. And we need to make a number of layoffs, which is difficult. But the shift in business is painful, but it does allow the company to operate a stable, profitable business that's consistent with our green ambitions. So Eat Well then focuses on transitioning its product set faster, and that strategy is well received, although questions still being asked about why those decisions weren't made sooner. So not exactly a completely free run, but I think overall those who voted to close down the business lines got closer to a better outcome. Now, before I turn to the panel, I don't want to end on a gloomy note. We want to look to the future, 2030 and beyond. I'm sure you're wondering what happens to Eat Well. Well, many firms across the sector are still struggling with various aspects of the transition to net zero. Given our pioneering work on greening our supply chain, though, Eat Well decides to create and lead an industry consortium. And that is by that we can share best practice. Our work here has made our supply chains considerably more resilient against the physical risks ahead, which is just as well because they're intensifying. And the company decisions have enabled it to pin its strategy to its green credentials, setting out an ambition to become the global greenest grocer, which becomes core to our brand advertising, and the younger consumers are responding with their wallets. So I think we're at the end of that. Let me turn first to John for your views on that last dilemma.
So first off, I was very surprised how much a shift there was. And as you can probably tell by my accent, I'm based in Chicago in the U.S., even though I work for a UK asset manager. And I would be so curious to see across all of these questions how directors in the U.S., particularly on that first question of how do you rate your current company, how they would have done. So that was just been on my mind. Okay, but specific to this final dilemma, I was very critical of the company, thinking about had it missed historical acquisitions because it didn't embrace real scenario planning that this could have happened, right? So I was really critical of what was happening. Ultimately, I do think you think ultra long term, next 10 years, next 20 years. I'm thinking a lot from an investor perspective of, is the investment community giving some sort of green valuation premium to companies that have a low carbon product base? And I suspect they would at that point. So I think, that would be something that I would be looking at, the niche competitors that had a focused portfolio that was all in this climate. But ultimately, I think I probably would be tipped into that second B, kind of go all out and refocus. I think the one thing that, of course, the question we don't have on our mind, which is the typical way you think, is that you're going to fund newer product lines with your existing profitable line, right? That's the classic way of thinking, but it appears that that could no longer happen at this company. So as a board member, I'd be evaluating, is that historical way of thinking, is there a reason we couldn't pull that off? We couldn't, direct your profits, your earnings to these new products, and that would be pretty painful to admit, and you had to do it by force. So those would be my reflection.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, at this stage where the whole world is so different, the context is different. It's okay. How about you? What are your perspectives?
I think this is sort of a classical case of hindsight is 2020, but perhaps there are some legal and structural lessons that we can take away from the Eat Well scenario. So if we think back from the fourth dilemma to the first, so where the company didn't have time to consider things, or it ran out of time in the second dilemma to make changes to then run off to sort of a quick fix for some of the challenges. In a way, the quick fix, it is still to some extent in the quick fix scenario in dilemma 4, by shutting down certain product lines and going full on green, pretty much at the last moment. So for me, this is cause to recall climate change strategy is probably in the rarest opportunity or in the rarest scenario, something that you can deal with on a quick fix. It is also, we've discussed the different skills that a board needs in terms of its composition. So the commerciality and looking at the financial capability as well, looking at carbon pricing, looking at the strategic issues that the board might be facing down the line, and really sort of this is a plea for that boards might consider scenario testing their strategies early on, so that they don't have to reach for quick fixes in the various dilemmas and at the end, because what we saw in dilemma 4 as well, this was a dilemma that came with some social backlashes, sort of closing down product lines, perhaps having an impact on employment, on jobs. So really, climate change, there is no quick fix, and it needs to be looked at as a major strategic concern. It is perhaps not good enough to say, therefore, from a legal perspective, also we deal with it when we have time. I think it is as important, also legally, in terms of the challenges that come out of there, as all the other pressures and challenges that a company has. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Catherine, your views, please.
I think... I think as we've said, ideally Eat Well would have thought through the product range opportunities and risks right at the beginning. I mean, we know right now today that consumers are not going to choose their way out of carbon intensive products. As long as they're available, they're going to be purchased. But we also know, and the data is really clear on this, that levels of consumption of these products need to radically reduce if we're to stand any chance of 1.5 or even 2 degree scenarios. So I think the learning here has to be that Eat Well, at the beginning of this journey, has the opportunity to lead the market in transitioning away from a product range that's incompatible and finding innovation investments, R&D investments that provide alternatives. I mean, I always think of the sausage roll, the humble sausage roll in this context. And, for UK residents, the Greggs vegan sausage roll is just as satisfying and eat as the meat version. And so, as a leading company, I think Eat Well's opportunity here is to take consumers on that journey and find new product ranges which are compatible with a net zero world, strengthening its brands for future markets. And clearly, I think John mentioned also from failure to achieve these carbon reduction goals is going to see Eat Well underperform on ESG indices anyway. So there's going to be an investment risk, whatever decision it takes here. And I guess the theme for me is think future, think longer term, don't just react to what looks like the current expedient situation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's come out kind of loud and clear. And David, you get the last word.
Well, thank you. I absolutely agree with what Catherine's just said. I very much would answer along the same way. I'm in box 2 here, closing those lines of business that help us meet the emission targets. But of course, one wouldn't want to do it as a knee-jerk suddenly in 2030. We can see some of this now. we can see consumer choices already changing here in 2022. And in my view, given what's likely to happen, you're going to see huge change in consumer choices in the years ahead. So the move towards being vegetarian, vegan, and so on is already there. Huge move from red meat to, if you're a meat eater, to poultry and fish, and all this is there. So we as a board of this company should be getting out ahead of this, and we shouldn't be making a decision in 2030. But if we haven't, to do this, but if we haven't, we should be doing it then. And that is simply to get out of the beef processing industry that you're talking about here, and moving, if we still want to be in meat at all, into meats which consume much less carbon for every calorie of food you're giving. So that means moving into chicken, for example, and away from beef. It means investing in many more vegetarian products, vegan products, and so on. And we should be doing this gradually over the next 5 and 10 years, rather than doing it suddenly. But we need to be in a position in the end which will allow us to get to zero carbon by 2045, and that means some pretty tough choices. If we don't do that, the company might not survive, and that's how maybe I'm be seen by some to be arguing slightly against what I said in the third vote, but the point is, in the end, you've got to do this. And if you're going to create a viable and profitable business for the future, and one that is doing the right thing for society as a whole on climate change. So there we are. There's the end of my answer for you, Joe.
Thanks very much. That was great. So before we just end up, we've got some questions. Here's a recap on today's scenario. So we started in 2022. Really with not much idea. We didn't have our first transition plan or our goals clearly set out. We had questionable offsets, carbon offsets dilemma in 2024. Then we had the cost of carbon, and then finally it's this hard commercial decision on whether we end some of our high emissions products. So quite a range of dilemmas there. I'm going to start with some questions, actually, and thank you very much to the person who said that this session has been brilliant. That's great. But one question we have here, let me just bring it up here because I've just been having a look at them all. So on the portfolio change point, presumably Eat Well would sell rather than, just scrap. So they could actually realise a bit of value and create resources. Of course, they would be selling to a private business, presumably. So that would do nothing to reduce real-world emissions, but it would get us get it off our portfolio, if you like. Now, that is a very live debate across a lot of companies at the moment. So I'm interested in how do we think about that? Is that the right thing to do, or are there reputational risks? Any offers of somebody who'd like to take that? Otherwise, I'll just pick on somebody. Can't see. Oh, we were all very quiet. Okay, David, you're in the screen. I'm going to go for you. You're on mute, David.
I must hit the unmute twice by mistake. You can hear me now, I'm sure. So look, This is you don't have much choice as a business in the end. If this is the direction you're going, and you want to put yourself in the right position for the long term. So you have option one, close the whole business down, sack a whole lot of people. Option two, sell it to somebody who's willing to buy it. You keep people in the jobs and you get some cash in. Who knows, maybe even pay someone a little bit to take it off your hands if it's really serious. It's my beef processing plant or something. But, I do find this a dilemma. It's a very good question. And it's very similar to the one we have as a country as a whole, or a continent as a whole. Europe has been outsourcing its carbon to China and elsewhere for years. And we stand proudly and sanctimoniously by saying, look, we're much better. We're closer to net zero. And look at those terrible people out there in China. We don't quite say it like that, but it's the same thing in the round. There's no gain for society as a whole if it just goes from one organisation to another. But I think you set the right terms for what hopefully is right for society over society over the long term by doing this.
Joe.
Yeah. No. Yeah.
Joe,
John.
I jump in. So there's two interesting corollaries to this. right, which are different, but I think do set some signal, right? So you have the obesity epidemic where there's super successful cereal brands that have, the question is, how do they offload those brands that are no longer good for society? You have cigarette companies that have, really profitable business lines. And they're not perfect, right? Because those don't have the same externalities that climate or that carbon emissions do. But you do see some learnings from those industries of whether they sell off their successful franchise. But I think David made the right call, which is what you see in the worst case scenarios is you bring those brands to different countries that may not have the same societal norms that you have, right? So you see sugary cereals getting moved to emerging markets, or you see tobacco companies leaving their developed countries and going to developing world. So there's that weird dynamic that I think this global element is super important to keep an eye on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do think I think it's a really excellent question, and it's something that, all companies really need to be thinking about. I have a broader question, actually, which may be for you, Julie, even though you're not on the panelist. But are you seeing or hearing boards talking about the perfect storm regarding risks linked to macroeconomic and geopolitical, meaning that plans regarding climate targets and the climate agenda are sort of being moved a bit into the rough?
So the answer is actually no, in terms of what we're seeing. I have to say that in February, March this year, we were very concerned at Chapter Zero that we would find this climate issue and nature and the things associated with it would just get knocked off the board agenda, and we'd be going back a couple of years to the board just not having the time and being distracted by all these other issues. I think it hasn't turned out like that. Boards realised that climate hasn't gone away. It's the big wave that's going to hit us, whatever happens in the meantime. And issues around things like energy security have in some ways brought it more to the fore, and food security for Eat Well. So we are not finding from our, albeit relatively small sample of, 60% of the FTSE 100 and half of the FTSE 350, we're not finding that people are saying this has got knocked off the agenda. We are finding that, boards are under pressure from lots of, inflationary issues and things like that. So they've got a lot on their minds, but they're still holding on to this as being a really important issue that they just cannot lose sight of.
Excellent. Well, that's certainly good to hear. So we have about 3 minutes. We're very near the end here. I would just a few comments actually from the audience. Somebody has said, we need to explain to the board about the opportunities that net zero offers. It's not just about the risks. And even at GARP, we completely agree with you there. I want to give all the panelists kind of the last 30 seconds each just to reflect on today's session and any key messages that they'd like the audience to take away. And I'm going to start with you, Silke.
Okay, thank you. To some extent, my key messages are those that I had already said. I think climate change is a systemic issue and challenge for companies. You need to all, in the various positions in the company, plan for it as such, meaning looking ahead, making sure companies are well equipped. Can your board make all the relevant legal statements in terms of expertise of the board? Is the board equipped enough? And does the board have all the relevant help that it needs in order to make the strategic decision that climate change will require? But it is always better to coming back to the first dilemma, to under-promise and over-deliver in this context in order to avoid greenwashing, whether that's short-term or more systemically. And overall, my main message really is climate change is a strategic and systemic issue for all companies that needs to be addressed carefully and strategically.
Brilliant. Okay, John, how about you?
Sure. So I think it's important for all the directors to realize that investors have a view on each of your companies of their climate profile. whether or not you know it or not. And so it's worth it to spend some time to understand your investor view. Sometimes they'll be very, very nuanced and careful, and other times they'll be pretty blunt and just kind of based on whatever data is available. So I think that's the key message, and just checking in with them.
Brilliant. Okay, Catherine, very briefly.
We need whole system shift. So no company can do this on your own. It's not just about partnerships with suppliers. Think about partnerships with investors, customers, and indeed your competitors, which may not be business as usual at all, but that's the time we're entering.
Fantastic. David, any last thoughts?
Well, final thought from me. Lots of companies have now got sustainability committees. In fact, most of them do. Great. But make sure you carve out enough time in your board sessions as a whole where, without pressure of day-to-day events, you stop and talk about these issues about the long term. That's really important. And to help you do that, nowhere better to go than the Chapter Zero sites and the discussions. So thanks for this, as far as I'm concerned. It's been really helpful.
Brilliant, thank you. And a very nice segue to Julie, just to round us off.
Thanks, Joe. And thank you so much to all the panel for all the contributions. I know we were trying to project forward to 2030, but a lot of this still actually feels very real in terms of today's conversations. So this, as you know, is part of the Climate Governance Initiative Summit, and the CGI has now got chapters in 22 chapters in 53 countries, including ours in the UK, and 100,000 plus members. So we believe that this really is a force to be reckoned with in terms of promoting climate discussion on boards. And I very much take the point about this is an opportunity issue, not just a risk issue. Fantastic opportunities are coming out through innovation. So please follow the work of the Climate Governance Initiative. We have the principles for effective climate governance, and almost everything we've discussed today can be picked up through those principles one way or another. And so a final point from me, which is we're all going to be publishing transition plans, and in many countries it's going to be sooner rather than later. So we really need to get on top of this. And thanks to all the voters and participants for taking part in the scenario with us today and joining us. I wish you a very good rest of day.